today we are going to talk about HTML. It's one of, uh, I- as web technologists, we do HTML a lot, and I feel like it's one of those things where it's really easy to get started with and do very simple things. And it's also very easy to forget that there's more than just a handful of elements. There's actually a lot of them. And so this presentation kind of focuses on what are those other elements that we can use and why we should use them. I'm going to skip that since y'all, thank you so much for the intro. I'll put links on my social about my socials at the end for those who want to find me. But first, let's start with the div, right? The quintessential cornerstone of HTML. It's a generic container. It has no CSS styling to speak of. It can do anything. It's block scoped, right? We kind of have its friend, which is not mentioned here, which is a span, which would be the inline version of it. But it's just the container, right? And if we look at the dev tools in our browsers, we can kind of look at what it has in terms of informations under the cover, and it literally has nothing. It does nothing. It has no role. It has no information. It is just there. So it's a great element to do a lot of things, but it doesn't really provide any value in terms of helping for the structure of our content. So let's look at a page, and this presentation is going to follow this kind of portfolio that's been put together. We're going to kind of work top through bottom and look at various elements that we could use to make it better. So this version is made with entirely divs. Every element in here is a div. And we can see that if we don't style it in any way, shape, or form, it's just words on a page, right? There's no structure to the content. Now, if I go in and look at the under the covers, what that looks like from a semantic standpoint, it's all text. There's nothing to indicate that anything has any particular value over anything else or what that structure might be. Now, if I use actual other HTML elements than divs, now we start to, even before we apply CSS, see that now there's a structure. We can start seeing, even though this is greatly zoomed out, we can start seeing that not all content is created equal, right? There are some pieces that are more important than other. And that's going to be true both from a visual perspective, but also from a technological standpoint, where things like SEO might look at this and be able to determine, oh, this is the important bits of content. So there's both an accessibility benefit to using proper elements, but there's also an SEO benefit to doing that. If we look at what it looks like under the covers, now we can start seeing that there's a structure to our content. And not only is that going to help us in terms of styling long-term and in terms of being able to tell what's what when just looking and reading through the code, it's also going to help us, again, with SEO and accessibility. Then regardless of which type we use, we can style it however we want, but that's where CSS comes in, right? That's a whole different ballgame. So let's work through this page and see what kind of elements we can use to make this a little bit more interesting and to make it better in terms of our HTML. I'm going to start with the landmarks. And the landmarks are things like your headers, your nav, main. And what those do is they allow for things like assistive technologies to be able to navigate the page more easily. Many of the screen readers now will allow users to skip from various landmarks to various landmarks so that they don't have to listen to the entirety of the page every single time, for example. They also denote things like, is this aside, for example, would denote that it's a little bit less important than maybe what's in the main region. Those kinds of things. Forms obviously have some sort of functionality behind it. So those are all elements that are going to help us in terms of determining what are the important bits of the page, where are the important bits of the page, and where our content is going to be. If we continue starting at the very top of the page and kind of look at those landmarks, the first one that is on the page is a header. And so you'll see that the first element I've put in there is, first of all, an H1. Most pages at some point are going to need to have an H1, right? That's going to be what the page is about. And inside of there, you'll see a Ruby tag. Now, that's one you may not have seen too often before. And the cool thing about Ruby, the Ruby element, is that it allows you to go ahead and put the pronunciation for a particular name. So in this case, the name Skylar Lewis. Well, first off, Lewis could have been pronounced Louis or Lewis, and Skylar. There's many ways to spell it. I went for the most convoluted one I could find on purpose for this example, but that would give somebody an example of how to go ahead and spell and say the actual name in question. The Ruby, if we look at how it looks like under the covers, we'll see that it has the actual RT element. That's where you're going to go ahead and put in that pronunciation. It's usually the most oftentimes when you see it is going to be for Asian characters. However, you can use it for anything else that's going to give you pronunciation guides, right? But most of the time where you're going to see it is for Asian characters. And can be done in the actual bit that's interesting is if you look at the spec, although it's usually used for pronunciation, it's actually just a simple annotation. So you could actually use it just to annotate text, and by default, with no CSS whatsoever, it's going to be displayed above the word. So for example, like how I have it up there, this is over here on the left side. You'll see this is the default formatting in Chrome. It's just going to stick it above the word. The thing is, not all of the browsers actually support the styling quite yet. So what you can do is add a second element. So you've got the RT, which is the pronunciation translation or transliteration. That's going to be required. That's the part that gets put above. But you can also put an RP, which is the fallback parentheses. So in an event such as an Edge or Safari that don't support the styling and wouldn't just stick it above the word like Chrome does, that would conditionally put in the parentheses for you. So that would allow, it would be beside the word in parentheses instead of above the word. So if the style is supported, it goes ahead and ignores the parentheses, but if it's not, it'll go ahead and put them in for you, which is kind of cool. Moving right along, we have address. Now, address is interesting in the sense of, at least when I started with HTML, I was pretty convinced that address was exactly for that address. Well, you can actually put a lot more than address inside of the address element. You can actually put, it's for any kind of contact information, really. So it could very much be an email address, your phone number, any way that's going to be to contact the person in question or the entity in question that you're referring to. So in this case, we can put, we can go ahead and put it. What's interesting about it though, is that there seems to be some interesting question as to whether or not like SEO takes it in consideration or not, which is, you know, kind of an interesting concept, especially when you look at the accessibility tree for it, which is, it's a generic. There's really no semantic meaning attached to it. What it does do, though, is it makes it really obvious if you're looking through a code base from just a developer experience perspective of, hey, this is where the content information lies. So there's a little bit of controversy on the internet as to whether or not it helps with SEO, but it exists and it's there. It does have a default style, which it will go ahead and put things in italics. So you can go ahead and, you know, choose to restyle that as you please. But that's kind of how that one works. Moving down to one of my favorite elements, actually, which is the definition list, or the depending on where you look at it, it's sometimes called a description list, sometimes a definition list, depending on the documentation that you read, which is kind of interesting. But that one allows you to go ahead and create lists of things. It's really beneficial for things like glossaries, metadata, those kinds of things. I tend to use it a lot in blog articles, for example, where you have like that little bit of information at the top where you might have like how long does it take to read, when was it published, you know, what technologies does it refer to, like all that kind of like bit of information that's related where you have a key and a value. So oftentimes you're going to have the key value pair kind of association with them. So you're going to have your term and then your definition. So if the browser, we can see that it has under the covers, it'll show you a term and definition. In terms of those, how that goes, like the order of the HTML really, really matters because you can have more than one definition for any given term. So you're going to have your term, which is the TD, and then your DD, which also has under the covers, says its description. It is styled a little funky in Chrome. So usually, I mean, personally, generally end up using a grid to go ahead and put them side by a display grid to go ahead and put them side by side, but you can do whatever you want in terms of styles, right? CSS will let you do what you want. What's also interesting there is that the role is going to be term versus definition, even though the actual name is often referred to as the DT or the definition title, or you'll see like I don't know why the documentation is so haphazard in terms of the naming, but there you go. So from there, all of these are totally legitimate, which is interesting because if you look at a list, for example, you can't put a div inside of a list, right? In order to style it differently, if you have a UL, you can't just randomly stick a div in the middle. Definition list, you can totally do that. You can also put more than one term for one definition or more than one definition for one term. That's perfectly legitimate, but it's going to look at the order to differentiate how you're going to go ahead and put them together and how it's going to group them from a semantic standpoint. So in the case of the one where I have one in English, one in French, and then um, an answer for it, you're going to go ahead and those two terms are going to be associated with that one answer versus the pronoun one underneath where you have one term but two answers or two descriptions is going to go ahead and associate those three together simply based on their order in the HTML. But this particular element, I think, is probably one of the ones that I think is more underused and could be so much better because we do things with metadata all the time. So that's one that, hey, don't forget this one. It's one of my faves. Anywho, moving right along, we have section. Section is really convenient for grouping like pieces of content in one kind of group. Usually a section is going to need a header inside of it, or that's to be able to tell, hey, what is this section about? In this case, we've gone ahead and put all of the about stuff for our profile in there, including, the images and stuff. And in order to handle our image, we have the picture. So picture has a lot associated with it, and you can do an entire talk on just picture and image optimization alone. I have one somewhere. But the point is that what this allows you to do is what picture allows you to do is not only determine, hey, based on based on screen size, you want to give different dimensions or different pictures. So for example, let's say in how often do you see a website or something where I have a big banner image, which is absolutely huge because you want it full width on desktop, but then on mobile, like you now suddenly don't need a 3000 pixel wide image on mobile and it takes forever to load. This allows you to go ahead and put multiple images and define a screen size and to say, hey, in case A, look at this one, in case B, look at this one, and so on and so forth. And then you put your default at the end. So let's look at that a little bit more closely. What ends up happening with that structure is for each source, you're going to go ahead and determine what image it is. You can go ahead and put in height and width. It's not required, but it will help you with things like reflow. So you can go ahead and give it what that dimensions are for that image so that you end up with the aspect ratio. And that way, as the image loads, then the HTML doesn't reflow. You're going to give it a size. That's the final rendered size for the image. So let's say you have a 300 pixel image, but you're only going to end up being, 250 pixels wide because of the screen width, right? We need to go ahead and determine that size based on how it's going to be rendered at any given point in time. So that's where, and you're going to use the same media queries as you would for CSS. So in this case, we're giving it like the max width goes for the media query, and then we can use calc in order to say what the size is going to be. And then your media is going to be, actually that has a typo in it, that max width should only be on media, but anyway, I'll have to fix that slide. So we can go ahead and set not only the size, but then when it is going to be applied, which is that media query. Image type, obviously, is exactly what it is. In this case, I've put it a WebP, but that can work with SVGs. It can work with any, PNGs, JPEGs. You just got to go ahead and give it that image type, and that's the standard MIME type for it. And then finally, you're going to have that fallback for browsers that don't support picture, although at this point it is pretty well supported. And the fallback image is where you're going to put that alt text for being able to have it available for assistive technologies. So this is a really cool element because it also means that not only can you resize your images based on the width of your screen, and serve up much smaller images when only a much smaller image is required, but it also means if you want to be able to say crop your image differently based on your screen size, you can totally do that because nothing says that the image that is served for your bigger than 640 pixel wide screens has to be the same as for your smaller pixel, your smaller screen size and vice versa. You could put something totally different in there. So it also allows you to tailor that without having to do a bunch of fancy JavaScript and all that fun stuff. When we look at kind of to just reinforce the point, when we look at the network tab for each of those, we can see that depending on the screen size, it only loads the one it needs. Which is also cool. So based on whatever your screen size was, when it loads, it's going to load that one. And as soon as you change the width of the size on reflow, it'll correctly load the correct one that you need, or on resize, it'll correctly load the one that you need at the moment that you resize the screen if you hit that breakover point for needing a bigger or smaller one. Our skill going down the page, we also have a skills section, which in this particular case has been made as a list. In our skills, we have a couple little interesting elements, and we have the ability, I made it so that they were clickable to kind of be able to just look at the concept of the dialogue. So let's kind of dig into that really quick. If we look at our list, the first thing we have is we notice that some of the words in our list are abbreviations, right? CSS is an abbreviation, for example. It stands for Cascading Style Sheet. In this particular case, in order to have it go ahead and give the I made it an on-click, it's a button. We're gonna talk about that here in a minute. But the title means that by default, when we go ahead and hover over it, it's gonna give you the full name, right? So we wanna make sure those match. We only include the title if the definition is not available somewhere else. Like if you're writing a paragraph and you introduce a new abbreviation and you have the word right there, there's no need to put the title in there. You're only going to do that if the context around it doesn't have the abbreviation as part of it. So let's look at that a little bit closer. If I have, so this would be the two use cases, right? Because there's no need in the redundancy in the title if you're going to go ahead and have the content right there already available. And the spec actually specifically points that out. So worth noting. That don't go ahead and put the title. Otherwise, the thing is, if you think of screen readers, they're going to read out those titles to people, so they're going to get that redundancy of it end up doing something like I love, and then it's going to read the title and then it's going to get it again, right? You're going to get the text and then you're going to get the title again. So it actually gets really noisy for people that are using assistive technologies, which is why you don't want to do it. The other piece that's here is I actually added a dialogue. What's really cool about the dialogue element, which has actually existed for quite some time, but is now actually fully supported across modern browsers, which is super cool, as it allows you to go ahead and create a dialogue without all of the extra cruft of having to use a library or anything like that. Historically, one of the number one reasons I'd start pulling in something back in the day it was jQuery. Now it's either, Angular Vue. Pick your flavor. We can get into the religious wars as to which one is the best. It doesn't really matter. But one of the reasons people, you pull in libraries is dialogues were so difficult to do. And so especially once you start thinking about things like focus traps and keyboard accessibility and being able to make sure like focus was in the dialogue and so on, it's a lot of code. Well, the dialogue element allows you to do that right out of the gate and has all the accessibility already written in, and you can get to open and closing it with very minimal JavaScript. Like what is displayed currently on the screen is all of the JavaScript, nothing more. And it has things like pressing escape to close it already built in and everything. It just works, which is awesome. By default, they're kind of fugly. You can they kind of need a little help on the HTML on the CSS aspect, but they do absolutely totally work. And you'll see that it does have under the covers a lot of information already built in, including that it's focusable, that it's a modal, and so on and so forth. So all of that is already pre-baked in, which kind of limits, like especially for small projects and websites where you may not want to bring in a big old UI library or framework, opens up a lot of doors for being able to do those pretty easily. Keep on continuing down into our profile, we also see the time element. So time is really interesting because time, of course, it takes a date time attribute. And so now we've gone to date time can take any date or any time. It's kind of loosey. It's the amount of, we're going to look at here in just a second, of all of the options that we can potentially put in there. Even though it's a time, you would totally put it, like, for example, this conference on their website, I don't know if they did, I'm going to poke at them just a little bit, could totally put a time element to say which dates, like dates and times that the conference was at. And so you go ahead and put it both visually as in the human readable version inside the element, in between the two tags, the opening and closing tags, but then you're going to put a machine readable version, which is that date time attribute. And so there you can go ahead and put any slew of options, including just a year, just a time, a local date time, a duration, which, I mean, if you want to get into the fun of how those duration, like, looks like the cat sat on the keyboard kind of code works out, have fun with it. But the point is, it's going to be your basic ISO stuff or a duration element. And you can go ahead and put, even though it's the time element, you can totally do, it's kind of same as JavaScript that have kind of, meshed up date and time together as to one big concept and this big fat mess. Yeah, that does it too. So yay for consistency. Um, Going down our line, we also have the concept of block quote. And block quote is super cool because it allows you to go ahead and, quote people. And then you can go ahead and cite what you've done. Now, in this example, and I need to update my slides on that because it was pointed out to me earlier and I didn't have a chance to update the slides because I was not doing it like right before my talk. Cite is technically only used for when you're citing a piece of published works. So it would be to be able to, so in this case, this example is actually incorrect. You wouldn't want to use the cite. If you had, say, a quote from like, I don't know, Tale of Two Cities or something like that, then the cite would be the reference to the published work by Dickens or something like that. But that's how, technically speaking, you're supposed to use the cite element. I've seen it used incorrectly in this way multiple times before. However, that is worth noting that, hey, that's supposed to only link to where you reference the actual published works. Figure is super cool, and you can put a number of things inside a figure. You can also put images inside a figure, and that's how you would link something like a image in a caption or a diagram in a caption, for example, or things like that. So you can totally put images in there. You can totally put your block quote in there. In my case, went ahead and put a quote in my site inside of my figure to group them semantically together. And you can see that it has the details, the figure itself goes ahead and references in the inside under the covers, go ahead and references their fig caption or their figure caption to determine what the details of what is being shown. So that does two things that are super cool. For the first thing it does is that when, let's say you're trying to lay out your image somewhere, let's say it's an image or a diagram, you're trying to lay it out on your page, you know your caption's going to stay with it, right? So you can go ahead and move that around, like float it, juice, flex, div, grid, doesn't matter, but they're gonna stay together, which is super cool. And then from a semantic standpoint, it'll make sure that assistive technologies and SEO know that, hey, that's a description for that piece of information. The fit caption is optional, as a side note. I already went down my my little tirade about cite and it being incorrect. So y'all already got that piece. There's two ways you can do a cite. You can go ahead and cite on the block quote itself as an attribute. There it will be semantically there, and it'll be there from a programmatic standpoint, but it won't show. Or you can use the cite element, in which case there it will be visible to the user. But for the attribute itself, it will not actually be visible to the user. So that might be a situation where you want to make sure for legal purposes or whatever you're citing your references, but don't necessarily need to display it. You might do that. But if you want it visible, you're going to have to use the attribute. Don't use both. You're using one or the other, right? So if you're putting it as an attribute, don't also put it as an element and vice versa. It's definitely one of those, one or the other. And they do both come with a little bit of styling by default in Chrome, in that the block quote comes up and kind of shoved over to the sides. It has some, it's got some margin on it, and then the cite will go ahead and be in italics. So after that, you can CSS it all you want, but that's kind of how those come by default in most browsers. Block quote versus queue. Queue is if you want it to be inline. Basically, they have very similar purposes and they work in very similar ways. They do have a handful of differences in that your block quote, you can actually put paragraphs in it. It can contain other elements. You could put a list in it. You can put paragraph in it. It can contain other and it is a block level element. Quote is inline and cannot have paragraph tags in it, right? So if your quote is long enough that, or what you're referencing or citing is long enough that you need paragraph breaks, you're going to block quote. If it's just like a one-liner somewhere, then you can go ahead and just put the quote, and it'll be an inline similar to your span, versus the block quote has the default styling and is a lot more similar to div in that it's a quote. So I know I threw a metric butt ton of elements right there really, really fast at everybody. So I do have I have this, the code for that little profile up on GitHub under, it's Martine Dowden / diversify your HTML. And you can also find all of my stuff, including links to my GitHub at martine.dev. It has all of the things, all of the links to all my publications, social medias, everything, and under publications, you'll see it has a link to this presentation and these slides. Thank you so much, and I'll take any questions for those who have it.
Thanks, Martine. That was great. So I know for my own, I was commenting about the fact that I have not used a lot of those tags and really should. Some of them I didn't know existed. Other ones I'm like, I knew that existed, but I just finished redoing a whole site and I'm like, I should have used that there. I was making notes like, go back and fix these things. But so for folks in the audience, we have a few minutes here for questions. If you have questions, please put it in the ask a question module or even in the chat. We'll get to it. Until then, I have some questions myself. So let's say I just finished redoing that whole site, and there's lots of places where I could have used tags that I didn't. I mean, what what tools do you use to kind of evaluate where you might have like missed opportunities for using semantic HTML or things like, is there anything you can use to say, hey, this you're missing that here and there?
So I haven't found a very good like one that suggests like new tags or say, hey, you could use this instead of that. But one thing I definitely always recommend is to run your stuff through an HTML validator, because
Hmm.
oftentimes it's really easy to forget where are you allowed to put like what elements are you allowed to put a paragraph tag or not inside of and versus and all and those kind of details. And so making sure that the HTML validates at all is definitely a great first step, because it's just easy to, you easy to miss one, right?
Yeah.
Happens to everybody. And then the other piece is to look at accessibility tools, Accessibility Insights for Web, which is a plugin by Microsoft, or you can just run Lighthouse, which comes in Chrome by default. Both of those are pretty good, and they'll give you Axe also works pretty well on that. It'll give you suggestions, especially if you have best practices turned on. Most of them have a setting for best practices, and it'll tell you things like, "Hey, you have no landmarks, for example, or you don't this." So that's the big important one from an accessibility standpoint. Make sure those landmarks are there for easier navigation, but it'll give you some hints on that, so that you can start improving your code. But I haven't found like a magic tool that's like, hey, this should, you've got divs here, and it should really be like a list. I haven't found a good tool that does that. No.
Yeah, that's too bad. I need like some kind of assistant just sitting there. Hey, by the way, you didn't use picture here. You can stop using just image and use picture and things like
Well,
that.
I mean,
Um,
image is fine. Like if a picture is one of those like the a nice way to figure out should I be using picture and doing that whole like multiple image size thing is to kind of look at your load time, because if you look at your load time and you realize that the biggest clobbering thing that's making your first load slow is your images, because your images are huge, and it's like that's a great one to be, because the big thing there is performance, right? So if your
yeah,
performance is suffering, that's a really great, pictures are always the thing I look at first, because it's really easy to go on something like Unsplash and be like, I want the biggest, baddest high def picture, put that in the site, and now you're, down 3, 4 seconds to get it to load because the damn thing's
yeah.
huge.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I was thinking even, I mean, getting into like the topic of like some of the tooling and frameworks, which can sometimes make it hard to say take your HTML, just validate it, because if it's, if you're using something like React, for instance, like just uh, div city. But one of the things I was thinking is a lot of these tools have built-in like image, like sorry, asset processing, right? So like I easily
Hmm.
could have done it and just put the picture and said, hey, give me a version of this image for this size, because I know in my CSS I have like styled that image down when you go to like mobile
Yep.
versus, and it would have been easy. I don't actually have to manually generate the images. I would have told the tooling, hey, I'd give me these different variations of the same thing. And yeah, I didn't. So
Some
now I
tools
need to.
have it, the auto generation as well. I think like 11D has a thing where it'll
Yeah,
auto like scale the images and everything. So that's, I think more than anything on that is remembering to do it. Like that's always the
yes,
hard part. Like it's setting it up so it'll do it.
yeah. I mean, 11D does. Most of them do. I was rebuilding a site with Astro, and Astro's got all the image processing as well. It's just
Oh,
I could do that for a straight like image tag, or I could have done multiple sources for a picture tag, and it would have been better. So anyway, didn't do it. Need to go back, do that. I also probably need to do the dialogue tag too. I think I did like a non-accessible modal.
well, there's two options now with dialogue, because so dialogue is really well supported, which is
Mhm.
really good. But depending on the use case, there's also the popover API now. which has all the accessibility built in. The problem is
Mm,
it's not quite as widely supported yet. But
mm,
that one, like for snack bars and things like that, is really powerful, or even for like tooltip type stuff is really powerful. But the support isn't quite there across browsers, and it's really new. Um, so
mm.
you're gonna, especially if you're trying to support people not running their updates quite as frequently as they probably should, you're gonna get people for whom it doesn't work. Dialogue is a lot safer from that standpoint. So kind of
Okay.
if you're needing to retool on that, definitely look up the popover API because that one has the it's just a it's more of a they have different purposes and built-in things about them. So they're worth so it just depends on what the need is more than anything. They both have the focus taken care of, like the pressing escape to cancel it, the backdrop element to go ahead and style it the way you want and do blurs or background whatever. So they both have it. So at
Mm.
that point, it's just which one has the functionality that you need.
Yeah, I think, there was nothing too complicated in mind, but I wanted to go back and check because I don't think I used the dialogue, and I'm like, I made some notes to go back because we just finished rebuilding the site, and I'm like, I did not check a lot of these things. I know some of them I use, but not all of them, and there are places where I could have for sure. Okay. Well, that's really all my questions for today. This was honestly like super useful because I need to go, like I said, I need to go back and look at stuff. You mentioned the CFE dev site where I'm like, no, don't look at the code there. That code is a little bit old, and and it's a big Hugo site that I just haven't updated all the stuff yet. So um, I really
I
should.
mean, if you're
But
not, I kind of always feel like if I look at my code that I wrote 6 months ago and I'm not irritated at some stupid mistake or I'm not embarrassed by it, then I'm probably messing up somewhere and probably need to retire and I'm done. Like I feel like
yeah,
everybody looking at code that they wrote more than a couple weeks ago is like, oh shoot, I should have done that different, or I know better now. I think it's
yeah,
just part of technology.